Welcome back for a new collections video, and this time we are doing my second favorite console of all time, the PlayStation 1. Enjoy the music in the background? I chose today Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex Strikes Back. So first up, look at the loose games. We have Blast Radius, we have Beast Wars, Transformers. Not necessarily the greatest game, but it does have a nostalgia factor. Also, Street Skater, Borderlands 2002, of course, with the Blockbuster logo. Colony Wars 3, Red Sun. Spider-Man, which definitely holds a special place for me personally, of the Spider-Man games. Also, Mega Man Legends, an all-time classic, one of my personal favorites. Also, Mega Man Legends 2, of course, another great RPG game of the Mega Man series. A guilty pleasure of mine with Blasto. Not a great game by any means, but I do love the bad puns and stuff in the game. Time Crisis, which is an all-time classic arcade shooter from Namco. Of course, another one of my guilty pleasures, Battle Arena Toshinden. Of course, I'm sure you know, the classic original Bloody Roar. Also, Bloody Roar 2, The New Breed, with, of course, Stun the Insect on the cover. Definitely one of probably the worst fighting games in my collection, Star Wars Masters of Terras Kasi. The original classic Twisted Metal, which this game is surprisingly pretty dang old now, hard to believe. Also, another one of the classic era Twisted Metal games was Sweet Tooth. Also, Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter. X-Men vs. Street Fighter. The original classic Tekken. Tekken 2. And of course, I'm sure everyone knows, of course, Tekken 3. With maybe the coolest design Yoshimitsu. Also, a pretty hard fighting game in its own right, Fatal Fury, Wild Ambition. Of course, one of my all-time favorites, Vigilante 8. Great soundtrack, great game. Another classic, Parasite Eve. An all-time great RPG slash horror game. The Future is Forsaken. Forsaken, which was great for a local multiplayer up to 4 people. This was just enjoyable. If you liked like multiplayer up to 4-player type battle games and stuff, Forsaken was one of the best of the time. In my opinion, anyways. But also, last of them, we have the original vanilla MK3, which I'm more favorable to than a lot of people. And of course, Mortal Kombat Trilogy. Next up, we have Rayman Brain Games, which was a educational game, which there were only a few of these actually released on the original PlayStation. But yeah, it was a Rayman educational game to teach kids about math and reading. But at the same time, it also had a pretty high difficulty, just like original Rayman as a whole. But still, it's a very interesting game to have in the collection. Also, one of the oldest compilations you could get, the collection of Activision 30 classic Activision games from the Atari 2600. Also, which I've already done past a quick review on. A Bug's Life, based on the, of course, Pixar film of the same name. Personal platformer that I still have pretty fond nostalgic memories for this game and the movie both. One of the probably hardest games in the collection, which is no surprise given the developer was none other than Atlas, which is known specifically for the Shin Megami Tensei Persona series. But this is a great, tactical RPG game with a great amount of difficulty, that is for sure. If you like a good challenge, this is definitely an RPG to check out. Also, of course, Crash Bandicoot 2. Another all-time classic platformer from the era, Croc, Legend of the Gobos. Definitely an interesting 3D platformer of the time. It would have one sequel. It is a shame that the series would not live on. It would only end up with like 2 games in the franchise, which is unfortunate. Of course, a classic from the era of early Crystal Dynamics, of course, Gex. A somewhat guilty pleasure of mine, Glover. Yeah, I'm one of those weirdos that actually likes this game. Also, all-time classic, Mega Man 8. Arguably, pretty much just about my favorite of the original Mega Man series. But everything is subject to opinion. Also, if you're a fan of classic style like Pac-Man and stuff, but you want to try some with a new spin, I highly recommend checking out Miss Pac-Man Maze Madness, as it is a legitimately good game. Then we have a very interesting game done by IDOS Interactive along with Crystal Dynamics. And yes, this still has the demo disc, which includes a demo of another action platformer and Tomb Raider 3. It's definitely not your traditional platformer of the era. Of course, as I've talked before, personal love for the Pac-Man World Series, and it all began with this. Plus, now we have a remake finally. Also, of platformers that have become forgotten over the years, Rascal. It is unfortunate that more people haven't checked out this game. I do highly recommend it, though it definitely has its issues at times in the game, but that's the way with a lot of your earlier 3D platformers, to be fair. Then a game that's virtually pretty much unknown, game that I just out of sheer curiosity chose to pick up one time, as it was like $4 in mint condition. It's an interesting puzzle type of game involving bombs, plus elements of platforming. And yeah, like you see, you can't actually save progress or anything. That's because it's a bit more old-fashioned. And of course, in my opinion, the somewhat criminally underrated Spyro Riptor's Rage, which I personally like a little bit more than the original Spyro. Maybe a somewhat controversial opinion, but that's just how I feel. This is my personal favorite of the original trilogy. But with that said, next up, we're going on to Colony Wars. Definitely an all-time classic. Can't deny, it's a great sci-fi game of the time, and it surprisingly has aged relatively well. It is unfortunate, though, this series will not live past the original trilogy on PS1. Now, if you're, of course, a fan of both Capcom and also puzzle games, of course, you can't do any better than Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo. Also, the original classic Rayman, one of the greatest classic platformers of the time period, pure and simple. Also, we got to see the sequel to the beloved Myst with Myst 2, or as it's actually called, the sequel to Myst, which is interesting, it's actually in the title. But graphically, the backgrounds and everything surprisingly still look great to this day. It's definitely a game that I have quite a fondness for, or in general, the series as a whole. Also, one of my personal favorite early era games, that being Warhawk. It's truly an all-time great, and I really enjoy this game. And then it would get a somewhat weird remake that I'm not as big a fan of. We would also see some unique stuff from also Square with games like Bushido Blade, a really cool weapon-based fighting game series that would end up getting a total of only 2 games, which kind of sucks, as the games are awesome. Also, the all-time classic Castlevania Symphony of the Night, one of the all-time greatest games, easily the greatest Castlevania game of all time. Also, I feel the somewhat criminally underrated Chrono Cross, which I love to death. And I will continue defending this game till the day I die. I will stand on the hill. Also, an interesting, somewhat classic dungeon-style game of the time, which was unique for PS1 era, Darkstone, which you're more likely used to with, like, the PC at the time. Of course, a game I've talked about many times I love, Die Strega, which is one of my all-time personal favorites. Also, a really awesome cult classic, Evil Zone. Some of the people who worked on the animation and stuff of this game were also involved in, obviously you can tell from some of the character designs, but were involved in Tenchi series. And a interesting 3D beat 'em up game that I still personally really like, Fighting Force. Next up we have a pretty good double pack you would get, which would include, as known as Final Fantasy Chronicles, Final Fantasy IV, and Chrono Trigger, which is a great combo pack. Also, probably one of the greatest double packs ever, Final Fantasy Anthology, which would include Final Fantasy V and VI, with Kefka, arguably one of the greatest villains, and one of the most criminally underrated villains with X-Death from 5. Also, can't look any farther than Final Fantasy VII, which is of course one of the big all-time faves of many people, though I'm that weirdo that still my favorite remains Final Fantasy VIII, and probably always will remain Final Fantasy VIII for me personally. It's all about personal preference and nostalgia. Also, the other classic, of course, with Final Fantasy IX, it is hard to believe all these classic JRPGs. The PS1 was a very lucky console to get all these greats from Square. Also, you had some really interesting and cool fighting games like Gundam Battle Assault 2, which was great if you were a Gundam Wing or a G Gundam fan. Especially for me, as a G Gundam fan, I loved the fact you could play with Burning Gundam. Also, classic early era, of course, Oddworld Abe's Odyssey, which is an all-time classic, would get updated known as Oddworld New and Tasty. But I still kind of like the classic cover art of Oddworld Abe's Odyssey, though my personal favorite remains Oddworld Abe's Exodus. I still will argue it's the best game in the franchise, and then probably behind it is like Stranger's Wrath, for me anyways. But leave a comment and tell me what your personal favorites are of the PS1. Next up, we're going back to another classic game from Capcom, and that being the great Rival Schools, which is a game I highly recommend to anybody who is a big-time Capcom fan. Also, you can't go wrong with the original Soul game, Soul Blade, which would really start the Soul Calibur franchise, and many staples, as you see, would stick around for many years to come. Siegfried, Mitsurugi, Wang, Voldo, Taki, Cervantes, Songmina. Lei Long would pass away, but his son, Maxi, would replace him. Also, a game I genuinely actually love quite a bit, Star Wars Episode 1 Phantom Menace, the game, based on, of course, the movie that I continue defending. And I will also argue this is a legitimately pretty good movie tie-in game, surprisingly. Also, the original classic Street Fighter Alpha 1, which I like a lot more than I think a lot of people out there. Also, you can't beat my all-time favorite Street Fighter game, Street Fighter Alpha 2. And this was always my preferred way to play the game of console. Also, sadly I don't have the cover, but I do have the backing, of course, Street Fighter EX plus Alpha, which is my personal favorite of the three games. Still love it, mostly for nostalgia, and I love it for a lot of the characters. And of course also Street Fighter EX2 Plus, which I thought was kind of cool that they put Ken on the front instead of Ryu. It was kind of an interesting switch up, which I actually appreciate. Of course, one of the greatest JRPGs, arguably, of the console, The Legend of Dragoon, which I'm still mad to this day has not gotten a remake, a remaster, or anything. Like, seriously, Sony, come on, revive this freaking game already. It deserves way more love than it's gotten. This is arguably one of the best RPGs of the decade when it came out, in my personal opinion, and it deserves a lot more love. This was a massive game. As with side missions and everything, you could easily spend 120 to 150 hours. And also, given the fact this was also a 4-disc game. Also, the classic Twisted Metal 2, which I still argue is the best of the Twisted Metal series as a whole. Arguably one of the most criminally underrated RPGs from the era of Squaresoft is this game. I love the freaking art style, and the fact it takes place in a familiar universe that you've already been to prior in a Final Fantasy game, which is awesome. And I love even the cover art and everything. Just the design of this game is beautiful in my opinion. Of course, the really cool Warcraft 2, the Dark Saga, which I am actually a pretty decent sized fan of this game. This is arguably my favorite, though I've never really played World of Warcraft, but I do have quite a bit of good fondness with this game, as it is a true all-time classic. And if you've never played Warcraft 2, do yourself the pleasure of actually trying the game out. It's a great one. Next up, one of the greatest classic arcade shooters of all time, in my opinion, developed and released by Midway, Area 51, which is easily in my top 3 favorite classic arcade shooters. I would say it's probably between Area 51. I would also have to put up there like House of the Dead 2, specifically from the Dreamcast. A very unusual, not a great fighting game per se, but BioFreaks is an interesting one to say the least. And definitely a pretty decent difficulty curve. Next we have the game in a series of 3 games that would start with Criticom, then go to Dark Rift on the N64, and would end with this game, Cardinal Sin, which is an interesting game, and as you see, this copy is actually still factory sealed, and I found it brand new for $15, which says this is not exactly a high-end demand game, obviously. Also, another one of the all-time classic survival horror games of the time, Dino Crisis. More or less Resident Evil, but with dinosaurs. Instead of dealing with zombies, you deal with velociraptors. What's not to like about that concept? And yeah, it also included a demo disc for Resident Evil 3. Also, of course, the all-time classic Metal Gear Solid, which has very memorable villains like Psycho Mantis and many others. And I know this game is definitely a big one in nostalgia for many people. It was a huge hit critically and commercially. and still remains one of the most popular games to this day among critics and fans alike. Then I feel the somewhat criminally overlooked and or rather underrated, criminally, Metal Gear Solid VR Missions. I freaking love this game. I actually played this game more than Metal Gear Solid. Believe it or not. I I can't even count how many times I've played this over the years. But I'm surprised more people don't actually talk about this game, which is unfortunate. Also, we have of course, somewhat, I think, maybe a bit overhated Mortal Kombat 4, which I genuinely like, though I'd say still stand by Gold is the best. But out of the two original releases, this is by far better than the N64 copy. And I actually like the cover with the fact that it shows they brought Goro back, which was a smart choice. Goro is a pain in the, well, you know what, to actually fight in this game. One of the coolest hack and slash style horror themed games of all time, and I'm surprised more people don't talk about this game, and that is Nightmare Creatures. Nightmare Creatures 2 may not be one of the best sequels, but Nightmare Creatures 1 was great. I loved the narrator, just everything about it, the different like creatures you would fight throughout the games and the surprises that came along, and chasing like the key villain. And I love even this, I think cover is pretty iconic to me personally. Then we have, of course, Resident Evil Director's Cut. Which reason why I have this, of course, Director's Cut version is the fact that it does support DualShock. Now that's the key reason. Now unfortunately, my copy being an original copy of Resident Evil 2, this was done before the DualShock, so DualShock analog controllers do not work for this game. Which does make it definitely a little harder to play with the D-pad. At least the D-pad is tolerable. But eventually I'd like to get my hands on maybe a greatest hits version of this, or some where I can actually use the analog sticks. But with that said, this remains my favorite Resident Evil game of all time. And I think this is the most iconic cover in the Resident Evil franchise. Where that is, of course, technically, obviously, it is supposed to be William Birkin. Or a zombie, whichever. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, with, of course, Nemesis on the cover art and stuff. Great game overall. Now, from what I understood, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis remake wasn't nearly as good, plus I like the original Nemesis face design better over the original. But yeah, that's how much I paid when I originally picked this up several years ago. Then, we come to the original classic, Silent Hill, which has become absurdly overpriced over the years, in my opinion. Last few, we have, of course, Spawn the Eternal, which is a interesting, mature style, actually, like, action platformer. And I did enjoy the fact I could fight, at least, Violator. But unfortunately, this is not the best Spawn game out there by far. A lot of people argue Super Nintendo Spawn or the Armageddon Spawn from the 6th gen is the best. But this is unfortunately the only one I currently have. I do want to get Armageddon though. This was a pretty cool fan-made thing I bought off of somebody I've gone like reproduction cases off of before. Does pretty cool work like this. Trying to make a actual what looks like an official release of Thrill Kill. In case you don't know too much about the backstory of Thrill Kill, I recommend checking out a fighting history video done by Maximilian Dude on Thrill Kill. It's actually quite an interesting story. Then we have a just reproduction case I got for my copy of Tenchu Stealth Assassins, which was of course done by, technically published by Activision, but it was also developed and done by From Software. So you can bet and expect, like, obviously high difficulty curve. And then the only two regular long box games I have. First up, Kingsfield, which is an all-time classic also done by From Software. This was the grandfather to what would become Dark Souls much later on. Though Kingsfield on PS1 is actually Kingsfield 2 game. But yeah, it's a first-person viewpoint, like, sort of like horror-themed RPG. So it is actually very interesting in its own way, and personally, I do like the cover art. Also, the only other one, of course, I have in the big long box is Battle Arena Toshinden 2, where you have on the cover, of course, Gaia with his redesign, and other new characters and other things, which is probably the best one of the trilogy. And last but not least, one of the greatest JRPGs of all time, in my opinion, and that being, of course, Lunar Silver Star Story. And yeah, this is the complete version, which includes everything. I love this game with a passion. More people need to know about it and actually try it. But with that said, I'll see y'all next time for another future one of these collection videos. Stay safe, and I'll see you again, same YouTube time, same YouTube channel.